Thank you, Colin. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. I see my panel is already waiting, so I'll invite them up to take these 4 seats near me, and I'll introduce them in a minute. While they're doing that, though, I was asked to say 1 or 2 remarks to set the scene for this conference. So almost exactly a year ago, the Soufan group published a report on foreign terrorist fighters and the threat of returnees, and I believe copies are available outside, because even though it's a year old, I think it still has some relevance to today. At that time, already about a quarter of these foreign fighters had gone home. And as the Minister said earlier, all in all, it was estimated that some 40,000 foreign fighters had gone to Syria and Iraq from over 100 countries. But the key questions that we were seeking to answer in that report were, who are these people? Where did they come from? Where are they now? What did they do? And what they're likely to do in the future? And most importantly, of course, what should we all be doing about them? And those questions still remain, and they remain because they're extremely difficult questions to address. There are huge political difficulties, of course, in dealing with returning foreign fighters. No government wants to be accused of being soft on terrorism, but at the same time, of course, have responsibilities towards their citizens. And after an attack, any government which can be said to have allowed somebody in who then committed an attack on their territory will be up for particular blame. So no government really wanted to deal with them, and it was an issue that they all wanted to really go away. And then on top of that, of course, were the practical difficulties of investigating what people had done, identifying who they were, collecting evidence sufficient to allow a prosecution, and then even if they were convicted of a crime, dealing with them in prison, how would you do that? What would you do with them on release, and so on? And the enormous resources involved in trying to monitor returnees in big numbers who were just trying to disappear into society. And then on top of that, of course, were the social difficulties of what the communities were to do. What were they to make of these returnees who'd essentially rejected their communities by going off to fight in Iraq and Syria? And then they were to come back, and if the communities would take responsibility for them, in some way perhaps that would stigmatize the communities and cause them perhaps to suffer from the extreme reactions that many people around the world were having to foreign fighters. Indeed, I think there was a problem for the whole of society in seeing how to integrate people who had gone away to fight largely because they were never integrated, they never felt integrated, and they wanted a new life somewhere else. Well, these difficulties remain, and of course many governments have seen the best solution as to hope for the early death or disappearance of these people. But as I said earlier, about a quarter of them had returned by last year, and now it's more like a third and a half. We'll hear from our panelists later how they assess those numbers and the threat that they pose. And then in addition, what about the children? What about the women? To what extent were women involved in Islamic State activities, and to what extent were they sort of innocent bystanders, if you like? That is still open for debate, and we'll hear during the conference more about that. And then, who are they? You know, where are they? Why did they go in the first place? Why did they come back? Were they disillusioned? You know, they wanted to get on with their lives and reckon they made a mistake? Were they perhaps felt that they'd done enough and then came back? So how will they feel in the future, 3 or 4 years down the road, when an ex-comrade in arms comes and taps them on the shoulder and asks for some help? Were they believers in the cause, but disappointed with the leadership, so that they're still very fired up and still very motivated to do something? Or were they just forced out because the Islamic State lost its territory and they had nowhere else to go? And if they didn't go home, where else might they have gone? As was said earlier, you know, what about the transit countries? What about the countries of destination like Afghanistan now, like Libya, of course, like West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, many of them now turning up. But in what numbers, with what intention? These are still issues to be decided. So there are clearly international responsibilities, there's clearly national responsibilities, and there's clearly social community responsibilities. And this conference really tries to bring together all those elements in examining what the whole of society response should be. And not just to talk about it some more, because there's a lot of talk about it, but actually work out some practical suggestions that we could all adopt, either individually, as groups, as nations, or as international organizations. So there's a cohesive and coherent approach to dealing with the threat from foreign fighters and returnees, but one that is based on knowledge, on research, on understanding, and indeed is proportionate to the actual threat that they pose. And these are issues which really need to be discussed and decided. And so I'm very much delighted to be here, not just in this effort to deal with the current phase of foreign fighters and returnees, but also to think forward, because there will be another phase. There'll be another cause, there'll be another issue which attracts people to go and join it from all over the world. What will it be? Will it be right-wing extremism in some way? Will it be a further sort of manifestation of the current problems that we have? Will it be driven by social issues, economic issues, political issues, whatever? There will be something. And by understanding this phase, maybe we'll help ourselves to get ahead of the next one and prevent it from rising into the tens of thousands and causing us such a problem now. So the first panel of several panels which will look at all aspects of this phenomenon and how to deal with it from government and from civil society point of view. I'm very pleased to introduce Gilles de Kerchove. I think he'll be known to many of you as the EU coordinator for counterterrorism. He's been in the position for 11 years now, I believe, and we are lucky that he's still going to be there for a few years more. And I'm sure he will have a lot to say on how not only the EU is dealing with this, but also how other member states are dealing with it as well. Peter Bergen is well known to all of you, I'm sure, as a CNN senior analyst on counterterrorism. He's also the author of several books, all of which sell extraordinarily well, and I'm sure we would all like to be able to imitate that, but he sets the bar very high indeed, a real expert and very engaging interlocutor on these issues. Fionulla Aolain is now the new UN Rapporteur on human rights in counterterrorism. It's an extremely important issue because, of course, many reports suggest that it's the failure to observe the rule of law and human rights that have encouraged people to join things like the Islamic State and to see in non-government or new proto-government organizations a better way of life for them. So we look forward to hearing from her. And of course, finally, but by no means least, Nick Rasmussen, who also many of you will know and have certainly heard of, who was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center in the United States from late 2014 to late 2017, and is now still in Washington area teaching and providing his expertise to the new generation of experts. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our panelists, and we'll start off right away with a few questions. Nick, I'm going to ask you, if I may, though, to come and sit here and swap with me, because that is the seat allocated for the moderator. Well, Gilles, perhaps we could start with you, and I could start by asking you to say a little bit about how European Union member states see the threat, particularly from foreign fighters, even beyond that, perhaps a little bit about the numbers and statistics, and how you see that assessment fitting in with the global assessment and how it drives the response of European Union member states to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. I will start with some figures and then one or two words on the trends and then address the challenges that all this raises. On the figures, we believe it's very difficult to put precise figures, but in Europe we've had more than 5,000 of our citizens or people residing in Europe who left for Iraq and Syria to join mostly Daesh and a little bit Jabhat al-Nusra. Out of these 5,000 fighters, so I mean men, 1,500 already returned, but very early in the process, around soon after the proclamation of the caliphate. We believe 1,100 have been killed. We know they have been killed, although sometimes people are not really killed. They try to let us believe they are killed, but that's another story. And so we are left with something like 2,600 people who should be in the region. But I think we cannot really take that amount for itself. It's just potentially. Many, as you said, may have left for another hotspot. You mentioned Afghanistan, you mentioned Libya, you mentioned the Philippines. I have not heard a lot going to Somalia. We were together recently in Kenya. When you see the development in Somalia, it is very worrying. It could become the second caliphate. And not a lot that I'm aware of going to the Sahel, West Africa. I haven't seen a lot of figures. So some may have left. Probably many have been killed, but we're not aware that they have been killed because the fight in Mosul, the fight in Raqqa was very hard, and maybe they have been buried and we're not aware they have been killed. 3, some are still fighting, and more, they are hidden in some places in Iraq and Syria. And so some may have already left for and are hiding themselves in Turkey or probably in the Western Balkans, who knows. So potentially a bit more than 2,000 men, 666 women, and 1,400 children. 600 of them were born in the caliphate, which is huge. It's huge. But when you look at the figures, we really have information of people detained, especially by the SDF in northern eastern Syria or in Iraq. The figures are much lower. 335 detained in Syria, Iraq and Turkey, 203 men, 132 women, and 94 children. So on the trends, as I said, the returnees came back very early around the proclamation of a caliphate. We haven't seen a massive return recently, unlike we expected first. Why? Probably because the organization was killing the defectors, and I would say mainly because the Turkish border is much better controlled now than it was before. Second, I'm very surprised that we don't have better intelligence. I don't have, maybe you have, Richard, on those who left for other hotspots. It's for me very unclear. Maybe there are not that many. Why? Because maybe there are few places which have the same symbolic attraction. The Sham was maybe a special case. And I remember what the head of the security service in France said very early in the process of the foreign terrorist fighters. He said, a lot of French young guys living in the French banlieue, they left for the banlieue of Aleppo because it was the same biotop. But very few of them left for northern Mali because it's 50 degrees and it's not their biotop. So that's the second. And the third one, in Europe, the main assessment is that the real threat now is homegrown. People who have not traveled to Syria and Iraq or returned from Syria and Iraq were just inspired by this terrible ideology. Some frustrated travelers because we've been extremely active to prevent them from traveling. So inspired, homegrown, prison leavers, and I'll come back to that in a second, and very few, but still some refugees. So let me turn to 6 challenges, and then I will try to speed up. The first one, when we have to spot returnees when they return. And that requires that we keep working on collection and exchange of information, especially battlefield information and biometrical data. Because many of the returnees are using fake genuine or genuine fake passport, I don't know how you call it, And recently I was in Bulgaria, they managed to recognize with a software of facial recognition a top leader of Daesh, American one, who was planning to mount attack in Spain. And frankly, I saw the two pictures, the guy in Raqqa and the guy at the border. These were different people, and unless you have this facial recognition software, you don't recognize. But the picture they had, let's suppose it was found by a special operation force in a safe house in Raqqa. The problem is that our military colleagues, they put top secret information on that sort of information. And it takes months, if not years, to reach the borders and to be used in court. So this is an issue with which we are working a lot with our American colleague. We need to find a way to declassify very quickly battlefield information. And the head of the Special Operation Forces recently himself decided to declassify 100% of the battlefield information. This is very crucial. And biometrical data as well. The second one is, and it's a big issue in Europe, what to do with those who are detained by the SDF, by the Kurds in Northern Syria. Because they don't want to keep them forever. They're not supposed to keep them. They don't want to try them there. And the risk, as we see it, is either that they release them. We were afraid that they would swap them against their own fighters held by Daesh, but they could release them, so you put on the market again these fighters, or that because they are together in small rooms, it would be a camp Buka #2, where Daesh was really created. And therefore, we need to find a way to, a solution to that. Our American friends are pushing the state who have still people detained by DS to take them back. Fyrom, Macedonia, accepted 8 recently. The Tunisians have 100. Are they in a position to digest the return of 100 of their fighters? Big question. And we in Europe have probably half of that. What is the policy in Europe in this respect? There is, for the time being, not an EU policy. Member states are making a difference between men and women, on the one hand, to answer your question, and children. For men and women, and women are seen more and more as dangerous. Intelligence showed that they were not just housekeeper and nice women waiting for the fighters to be back every evening. They were involved in, on internet, in propaganda, member of the religious police, and so on. So the member states in Europe would like to adjudicate and try them in the region. But it is difficult, because neither Syria nor Iraq are members of the ICC. There is the death penalty in Iraq, and we cannot accept that. And we don't talk to Assad. So we are talking to the Iraqi to see if we could not find a solution to try and adjudicate all these detained in the region. But that requires, again, that we get access to this battlefield evidence, not just information. And we are supporting a quite impressive NGO called CIJA, Commission for International Justice Accountability, because both the Kurdish force and the Iraqi army have collected a huge amount of battlefield information data in Arabic. So we're trying to digitalize and index all this data, because if you want to secure a conviction, you need to get a speedy access to this huge amount of data. We need to get a much speedier access to digital evidence, because in most of the cases, the only evidence we have that someone was involved in foreign fightings was part of Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra is an email, a video, a YouTube, and most of the time it is stored in a cloud in California. And for the European prosecutors, it sometimes takes a year to get access to a digital evidence. So we are working on a legislation, and we're talking to American friends to get a speedy access, a direct access to digital evidence, e-evidence. And 3, we need good risk assessment tools. If we cannot secure a conviction, we need at least to assess the level of dangerousness of someone returning, and then try to find a disengagement program. So that's for men and women. When it comes to children, member states, they do handle them on a case-by-case basis, sometimes with the assistance of the ICRC. We have to see the children first as victims, The average is around 4, 5, 6 years old, so they need to be treated as victims. As the victims they are, they've been traumatized, and we need to bring them psychological treatment. Some have been indoctrinated, and some even military trained. But the question is, should we have, and I'm in favor of that, an EU policy and be more proactive, to bring them back more proactively, which requires, I believe, to be politically feasible, that we accept to split the children and their mothers. But the question is it in the best interest of the child to split the children and the mother? I believe yes. When there is abuse, you will withdraw the child from the mother. And the second one is to have, in all member states, but most of our member states have that, special procedure to handle the children when they come back. One word on what I said on homegrown. Most of the terrorist attacks the last 2 years have been done by lone actors or small cell, as we've seen in the Netherlands some months ago. So what are the challenges? Again, spot early signs of radicalization as soon as possible, which bring our intelligence and security service to change a bit the approach. Now MI5, and it's quite a revolution, believe me, accept to share a bit more with the local authorities so that they know where to look into. We need to train frontliners to spot these early signs, be it inside prison or outside prison as well. Have hotlines where people can report to the police, and more I see the security services using big data softwares. The second big challenge, and it's probably the most difficult one, is to set priorities, because if you look at the 3 largest member states, Germany, UK, and France, they have identified something like 20,000 people at some stage of radicalization. It's impossible for the security services and the police to monitor 20,000 people. So they need to just identify those who are the most dangerous one, the most radical one. And I know, for instance, the Germans have a risk assessment methodology that they have developed with scholars called Radar, which allowed them to end up with 250 out of 20,000, which is amazing. It's a challenge. And even more difficult is what I call the tipping point. Because in most of the recent attacks in Europe, the service knew the guy, knew he was radicalized, but failed to determine the tipping point, where the person starts planning a concrete attack. Because being radical is not a crime in itself, it's just when you start preparing a concrete attack. And this is very difficult, and that's critical, because that's when we have to intervene. And so this is a big challenge, because in a way, the issue for security service and police is not to a lack of information sharing more and more. It's more, can we improve the way we analyze the tsunami of data that we now have? Because we have collected so much, and our American friend will, I'm sure, confirm that. And finally, I think the big question now is, how do we address the ideological dimension? As was said at the outset, yes, there are objective reasons why people get radicalized in the first place. There are objective reasons why young guys want to fight and go to the Sham to fight for the caliphate. But part of it, and we have endless discussion on the exact nature of the ideology as a driver of radicalization, but it is spread through internet, it is spread through satellite TV, it is spread by radical preachers, and we have to do a lot more on that. Europe has started working hard on internet, not enough on TV, and there is a debate we have started in Europe, and I raised it with the Minister of Foreign Affairs just this morning, is how can we in Europe find ways to improve the diversity interpretation of Islam in Europe. But I can develop that later. 1 or 2 words for the last 3. Prison leavers. This is the big challenge now, because if you take only France, they have 450 inmates who will leave prison. They will have served their sentence, but they are, by end of 2019, and they are highly radical. What do? They have served their sentence. You cannot impose additional sanctions. They have served their sentence. So maybe you have to invent some sort of administrative measures to follow them, regular reporting to the police, electronic bracelet. The Brits have their control orders, but we need to find a way to address that and improve. That's for me, with the ideology, the big challenge, effective disengagement program. We're not there yet. I think we're not there yet. And the last two is refugees. I don't suggest refugees are terrorists at all, but we've had several cases recently in Europe because these are vulnerable people, and we know that sometimes they may be recruited. And I have a special thought about the children refugee who have lived in Daesh-controlled territory, have been through this distorted education process. We have to do a lot more. And finally, help the countries around Europe, especially the MENA countries from Morocco to Turkey and the Western Balkans, to help them to digest the return of their own fighters, and many of them are not prepared to digest them. I've been too long.
Gilles, that was fantastic and raises a whole lot of issues that we can discuss. Excuse me. And I should mention that there will be a period towards the end of our session when I invite you to ask questions of the panel. So please do keep a note of some of the issues you'd like to explore further as we go on. But right now I'll turn to Peter, if I may. Peter, I think the role of the media, of course, is absolutely critical in the whole public perception of the threat from terrorism. It's an extremely complex issue, very difficult to fit into sort of media-sized sound bites, and in this sort of increasingly polarized world, you know, of which CNN, I think, has also suffered to a certain extent. How do we get across a deeper understanding and therefore a more proportionate response to the threat from terrorism? You know, what should that be, and what role should the media have in shaping it?
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you to the Soufan Center for organizing this. You know, the media gets much of its information about foreign fighters from the government, and I know Nick Rasmussen will talk about the United States in a minute. I would say the media has covered this issue, you know, at least with some depth. I mean, this is a Sunday Times UK from Sunday, 2 days ago, up to 80 ISIS brides streamed back to UK. So this is a story that the media naturally is interested in covering because it's dramatic, it's interesting. And I would say if the media could be faulted, it's probably more in the case of exaggeration than undercoverage. And I'll give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. So in the United States, a figure that is often used by the media is that 300 Americans traveled to Iraq or Syria to join jihadist groups. Now that figure actually comes from the FBI, and the figure is quite misleading because the number of Americans who've actually traveled to Syria or Iraq is probably just a few dozen. Almost none of them have returned. George Washington did quite a useful study, found that a dozen had returned. Only one of those plotted anything. And as Gilles just pointed out, the issue is really not returning foreign fighters, particularly in the United States. It's homegrown domestic terrorists, and we've seen, you know, just last week, a right-wing terrorist killed 11 people at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And in fact, every lethal terrorist attack in the United States since 9/11 has been carried out by a US citizen or legal permanent resident, not by a returning foreign fighter, not by a foreign terrorist organization. So the real problem as far as the United States is concerned is domestic radicalization. And Richard, you asked at the beginning, you know, should we be thinking about the future, and how should we be thinking about the future? And I would just want to make a few points about what I think the future looks like, which is ISIS wasn't really the problem. It was a symptom of a whole set of problems that continue to exist, and they exist in the Middle East and Europe, and they don't really exist in the United States and Australia and New Zealand, countries built on our immigration. And these problems are the following, and I'll just run through them very quickly. The Deputy Prime Minister mentioned sectarianism. You know, this to me is the critical issue, because If you go back to Osama bin Laden and 9/11, he never mentioned the Shia. Al-Qaeda never talked about a war against the Shia. They talked about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. They talked about the Egyptian government, the Saudi government. Now, ISIS propaganda is almost nothing to do with these issues. It's basically all about sectarianism. And we've seen sectarian wars destroy Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. And this sectarianism is not going to go away. The second big issue to which the United States contributed to is the collapse of Arab governance. And we overthrew the Iraqi government in 2003 without a plan for the day after. We overthrew the Libyan government in 2011 without a plan for the day after. And this, of course, has helped increase the issue of failing states in the Middle East into which these groups insert themselves, because these groups are not by themselves strong. They prey on weak hosts. And the third issue is the collapse of Arab economies. Youth unemployment in the Arab Spring was 27%. It's now 30% in the MENA region. And then you add to that the demographic bulge in this region. And then you add to that climate change, which is making parts of this region increasingly inhospitable to live in. And then and as a result of all those things, you have this unprecedented wave of immigration into Europe from the Muslim world. And then you have the rise of anti-immigrant parties, proto-fascist, ultra-nationalist parties, and they have the alienation of Muslims in Europe. 8% of the French population is Muslim, but an estimated 60% of their prison population is Muslim. And you add in the growth of militant Salafism in Europe, and you add in social media, and you have a very toxic mix. And we don't know what the son of ISIS is going to look like, or the grandson of ISIS, and it is unlikely to be as successful as ISIS, which controlled, territory the size of the United Kingdom and population the size of Switzerland. But it will be something. It will be something. There will be a conflict in the Islamic world, whether it's, as Gilles mentioned, in Afghanistan or Somalia or the Philippines, where this group will set up some kind of proto-caliphate and attract the next wave of foreign fighters. So that, unfortunately, is my rather sort of pessimistic conclusion.
Thank you, Peter, and indeed a few issues to come back to on that. But I'll turn first to Fionulla and ask you maybe to talk a little bit about the importance of the rule of law and human rights and so on in dealing with the threat from terrorism generally, foreign fighters perhaps in particular, and perhaps also picking up on Peter's point about the collapse of Arab governments as a result of Western activity. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, and my thanks to the Soufan Center for this invitation and underscoring the importance of the conference. Let me just say that my remarks about threat are contextualized by a focus on the human rights and humanitarian perspective. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the international legal norms that frame our responses to foreign fighters, specifically the Security Council resolutions 2170, 2178, and 2396. All of these were adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and that adoption means that we have moved significantly post 9/11 to defining threat in a way that includes terrorism as a threat to global peace and security. But I want to name what I would call the 5 challenges in this field. And the first is what I want to call the contamination challenge. So as I've pointed out elsewhere, the Security Council's legal regimes, complemented by regional legal regimes such as the EU directive, the 2017 EU directives, they're extensive and they're far-reaching. And I and others have articulated a really serious concern that while these regulatory schemes have been expressly authorized on the basis of a compelling, specific and defined threat, that threat being foreign fighters, the regulatory language is insufficiently precise in some aspects, and therefore it enables states to extend the use of these measures to a wide range of groups and persons, including groups and persons who are protected and engaging in protective activities under international law. And I think this migration pattern of exceptional to normal is one that we're deeply familiar with in the counterterrorism and emergency sphere, and it's one I think that we're increasingly seeing in the international sphere. And it states the obvious, that when we have crossover of exceptional regimes, they are usually and not unsurprisingly associated with systematic and sustained human rights violations, often with concentrations of executive power and a lack of transparency and accountability. So let me mark, I suppose, as a starting point, the challenge of crossover and the containment of the specific regime designed for foreign fighters to the very specific space of foreign fighters, and flag the deep concern that it in fact is moving and shifting elsewhere. The second challenge I want to talk about is the challenge of what I would call unintended consequences. And I want to underscore, in part picking up on what Peter has said, the extent to which the response to the phenomenon of foreign fighters may be intrinsically linked to the long-term management of the threat itself. And that point has been recently underscored by a really substantive and weighty and well-carried-out study, which is rare in this area, of pathways to extremism. And the most striking statistic, perhaps, in that study was the finding that the tipping point for almost 2/3 of the individuals engaged in violent extremism or terrorism was an abuse of law or of human rights. And so that should all give us really serious food for thought as to the interdependent relationship between the push and pull factors with rule of law and human rights deficits. So the third challenge I want to talk about here, or the third threat maybe, is the challenge of what I'd like to call generic and decorative international law invocation. So as the relevant Security Council resolutions on foreign fighters were passed, many of them were passed in significant haste, a feature that's not unusual to exceptional powers also in the domestic context. And the old adage of marry in haste, repent at leisure comes to mind. But let me just say that as a result of the haste, some of it warranted. It's very clear that states and the Security Council in particular had to respond to a threat. But that also creates, as we know, just as it does in domestic legislation, it creates a number of human rights-related challenges that I and my predecessors have identified with this regulatory framework. And so what we see are generic references to human rights and international law, and they are welcome, but they're generally unmoored to any specific requirements of benchmarking or review. So if we take the resolutions at face value, much of actually the language on human rights is pretty superfluous, because it doesn't have any concrete specificity or enforcement, unlike the unambiguous and really quite precise requirements for states in the context of data collection, criminal justice, and cooperation. And very few resources, my office is a part-time office, are spent to ensure that these resolutions are in fact transposed in a human rights compliant and rule of law compliant way. And I want to acknowledge the extraordinary work that CTED does in this area, but to say that acknowledging that there isn't a kind of a human rights plank in the counterterrorism framework is an extraordinary deficit, and one I think that needs to be remedied. The fourth challenge I want to talk about is the challenge of insufficient, inadequate, and limited data. And I speak here as a social scientist who's regularly appalled by the quality of the data we see in much of the work that passes for evidence in this area. What we need, I think, is linking granular levels in particular, and I think this goes to comments that were made earlier, granular levels of risk assessment with appropriate and calibrated legal responses, as opposed to the sledgehammer of singular approaches, in particular to returnees. And I think that is important, not just in its own terms, because it's legally based and it's rule of law compliant, but actually it brings us back to that loop we're all trying to avoid, is that the responses themselves don't become implicated in fact, extending and expanding the problem. When we fail to have that kind of granular, precise, and scientifically based risk assessment, we have distinct rule of law consequences, and we have deep problems of legality, proportionality, and discrimination. And to state the obvious, these are fundamentally counterproductive to effective management of highly vulnerable and risky populations. I'd also state the obvious, that there's a really crying need for robust qualitative studies that directly engage with returnees and returning populations. And just as an anecdote, the mandate I had a country visit to both France and Belgium last year as mandate holder, and spent a fair amount of my time visiting jihadists in prison and interviewing them. And while I can't speak to the specificity of those interviews, what I can say is that we would learn a lot by talking to them. in many ways, both in terms of being more efficient, but also understanding the push-pull factors and having better and tailored solution at national level to actually address the problem. Finally, let me talk about the challenge that the misuse of foreign fighter regulations, whether they're legal or administrative, the misuse of foreign fighters' legal capacity to do other work. And so as mandate holder, I am particularly concerned with wide, ambiguous, and distinctly nefarious definitions of terrorism that are proliferating at a tremendous pace at a global level. Last year I submitted a report to the Human Rights Council that benchmarked precisely this problem, because we don't have a globally agreed definition of terrorism, which means that states are free to craft their own, and many do so significantly outside of the boundaries of what the Security Council itself has defined, and do so in ways that are profoundly counterproductive to the enterprise of addressing the problem of terrorism. And so I want to note that the day-to-day work that I do as mandate holder through the communications function, so my office in Geneva receives communications from individuals and groups, is overwhelmed by a tsunami of targeting of civil society actors, bloggers, journalists, intellectuals, moderate religious leaders by states under the banner of countering terrorism. And that does very little to advance the cause of actually addressing terrorism itself, but creates again that vicious cycle of in fact using the law to do things that are ultimately defeating the very goal we ought to have, which is addressing meaningful and absolute threat. Let me point out the very obvious, that the proliferation of these vague and highly problematic definitions and regulations at the domestic level, when you layer on top of that a sort of a scheme of Security Council resolutions which require states to do more. And I think it's really important to note, I'm going to sound like a very nerdy lawyer, but there's a very pedantic, the language of those Security Councils does not entirely limit the scope of regulation to foreign fighters. And that's important because it leaves open an interpretive space where states can use the very specifically crafted language of the resolutions to do other work. And I think we all ought to be deeply concerned when states are empowered to do more in ways that creates an obvious danger of this spillover of what is an exceptional legal regime designed to craft to a particular problem, to abuse and dysfunctional application in ways that I think creates the kinds of cycles we are all anxious to avoid.
Thank you very much, Fionulla, and issues there too about political bodies making judicial rules and so on. And perhaps we can come back to that in our discussion. But Nick, turning to you, I mean, you were very much involved, of course, in United States efforts, and as Peter said, in fact, the foreign fighter problem wasn't particularly great in the United States, but even yesterday, I think, some person was charged in Ohio with supporting Islamic State, and so the attraction nonetheless is there for some homegrown radicals. But even though the US wasn't so involved itself in the foreign fighter phenomenon, of course it was enormously influential in the response. And I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about how that evolved and its impact on the global effort. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Sir Richard, and to my colleagues on the panel. You've laid out a very rich picture of the foreign fighter challenge. And during the latter years of my period of government service, I focused on this challenge mostly from an intelligence perspective, trying to build a knowledge base for the United States government so that we could understand the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters, and not just as it represented a threat to US interests, but as it contributed to terrorism problems around the globe. And so I would argue that a tremendous amount of time, energy, resources, and effort went into building that knowledge enterprise. And I would argue that the results that emerged from that level of effort are mixed, I think, at best. On the very positive side, I think there's definite goodness in one big piece of this. I think we very much accelerated the information sharing enterprise when it comes to terrorism issues globally. I think the fact that so many of our countries around the world were facing some sort of challenge tied to foreign travelers, foreign fighters, individuals who had made their way to the conflict zone in Iraq and Syria. That was a unifying factor, something that brought governments together in ways that I don't think were necessarily evident in some of the other, maybe perhaps Al-Qaeda focused periods of our terrorism experience post 9/11. And the imperative to share information was thrust upon each of us, on all of us, and I think it created much more successful and new patterns of sharing than would have probably existed otherwise. So that's a good news piece of the story. On the less good news side of the equation, I think that the immense amount of effort that we went through to gather information, and gather information literally from every imaginable source, everything from sensitive intelligence information gathered by our security services to battlefield intelligence of the sort that Gilles was referring to, but also social media information, Facebook postings, YouTube videos, literally every source of information you can imagine to try to identify who these foreign fighters were and to attach an identity to each of these foreign fighters. I'm afraid that all of that work probably gave us a false sense of precision and a false sense of confidence in the degree of understanding that we have of this phenomenon. And I'll point to 3 areas where I think we're more wrong than right, which will, I hope, underscore why I'm saying what I'm saying. In the first case, I would point to numbers. I think Sir Richard mentioned early on that the kind of accepted figure that we all were dealing with of approximately 40,000 or approaching 40,000 foreign terrorist fighters fighting or arriving in the conflict zone in Iraq and Syria is something that I think carries with it a false sense of precision. And I know from talking to my colleagues in government today that if anything, there's a sense that we may have underestimated the true number. And again, now when my intelligence colleagues in Washington are asked these questions, they're much more likely to give a bounded range rather than anything approaching something that gives, as I said, this idea that we were counting each and every fighter who arrived on the scene in a conflict zone. Another area where I think we, in a sense, predictably had it wrong was what would happen as the conflict began to subside, and Gilles alluded to some of this. I think we expected in response to a subsiding of the conflict or a slowing down of the conflict on the ground, we expected a much more massive and rapid outflow of foreign fighters, and it simply hasn't materialized. And some of the factors that contribute to this have been cited. Better border controls by our Turkish friends, the information sharing apparatus I described earlier. Many individuals know that if they leave the conflict zone, they are destined to either face criminal charges or worse, custody outside of rule of law framework in their home countries. So again, I think we had pointed to a picture that foretold a massive outflow when in fact that has not been the case. And then lastly, the third area where I would argue where we, in a sense, got it wrong with our predictive analysis was what would happen with this outflow. I think we, at various points, talked up specific scenarios in which these individuals, or large numbers of these individuals, would show up in other conflict zones. And again, my sense is that that just simply hasn't materialized. It's happening, but in an anecdotal and episodic way, not in any kind of mass migration or mass movement way. That's probably a good news story because most of those conflict zones would not have been in a position to bring a positive result to those foreign fighters if they were to show up, whether that would be in Afghanistan or Somalia or Yemen or Libya or some other conflict zone. So I guess I would close by saying that all of this detailed work that we've done on foreign fighters over the last half decade, I would argue has greatly improved our understanding, but it also fills me with a tremendous amount of humility as to how much we still don't know. It is a data-intensive exercise, and a point Peter made is worth reiterating. The media likes to write about this because there are so many compelling anecdotal stories. A young woman who travels to a conflict zone to become a war bride and has a very compelling story about bringing up children in the caliphate. And yet these anecdotes don't necessarily shed light on what we know by way of broad trends or what we can know about the picture in the aggregate. And so I would argue, I think one of the values of a forum like this, and I'm grateful to all of our sponsors for bringing us together like this, is that we can share data because we, again, as Fionulla also mentioned, we are way, way short of the data we need on this problem in order to be able to develop systemic whole of government solutions. As an intelligence enterprise, I think we did a very, very good job in terms of the targeting end of things, of understanding who among the foreign fighter population might pose a threat to our society or to other societies. But in terms of understanding it as a sociological phenomenon, and certainly in terms of equipping ourselves to come up with a whole of government solutions, I think we're a long way short of success in that area. I'll stop there, Sir Richard.
Well, thank you for that. And this issue of data, and as Fionulla said, the quality of research is one that you've all mentioned in one way or another. But Gilles, you were rather more precise in your figures and so on, and that suggests that perhaps in Europe there is more understanding of exactly who went and perhaps even of why they went. And as you said, the returnees all returned early, so perhaps there's been an opportunity now to understand why they returned. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more on the sharing of data and the quality of data about foreign fighters.
The reason why people left, I won't touch upon that, but Europe has made huge improvement in the way we put data together. We were confronted with a real competition which the Americans tried to overcome after 9/11 when they decided to create an information sharing environment and connect the dots. We have now been through that. It's not perfect, but on one side the intelligence community organized itself much better by creating a common platform. They share 100% of what they have, no doubt. And the way our member states are now populating and using the database is amazing. Myself decided to report every month to the 28 ministers of interior, giving them, each of them, their scorecard, what they were doing and not doing enough. And I remember one day they asked me to consolidate all the data, and I showed them there were 4 categories of member states who were not populating nor using the data well, those who were doing that well. But there were another 2 categories which were very odd, those who were populating database but not using them, for instance at the border, which I would call the stupid member states, and those who were not populating the database but using them a lot. And we are over. That's over. No, I think there is a huge improvement. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, in terms of analysis of data, I think we're not just quantitative, but qualitative. We've made a huge progress in understanding the phenomenon, and the European Commission has invested a lot in this by supporting member states, NGOs, universities, and so on. So yeah, I think on that front, we've made progress. As I said, where I think we need to do a lot more and a lot better is on disengagement and on reintegration. I think that's still the real missing aspect of our policy.
Yeah, and you also made the very valid point of people who've been prevented from traveling, and of course these frustrated foreign fighters, if you like, may be more of a problem than the returnees, in that they didn't get the bucket of cold water of reality of actually being in the Islamic State. But Fionulla, going back to your point about the inadequacy of the regulations and so on, and that maybe they're not properly based on data, but also they're being made in a political context to a public audience, and although they attempt to address the problem, perhaps they are too hasty, but how do you get over that problem?
I mean, I think I would make a distinction between 2 kinds of data. There's qualitative and quantitative data, and certainly I would say that there's been a distinct improvement in the gathering of quantitative data, and the methodologies are better, certainly at least by, I would say, some core states. But there are many states who are still not gathering quantitative data well. They don't have actually they just simply don't have the capacity. It's a technical capacity issue as much as it is an issue of will. The qualitative data is more complicated. I don't know. We have the UNDP study, but frankly, we don't have, that's a study of 500 return jihadis, a mixture of prison and non-prison populations. But we don't have studies of that scale. In fact, that's the only one I think we have that's in any way robust. Part of the reason for that is that these are difficult populations to do data gathering on. There are security issues that prevent access to those populations for good reason. And also, I would say there's counter-terrorism legislation that makes access or use of that data actually an offense for journalists and for academics. So, I mean, there are actually barriers to access on that kind of data that I think we have to address. And you know, it speaks to the other thesis I would just note here is that we're getting better on disaggregated data on sex and age, but also, you know, for example, if we take the phenomenon in the regular criminal population, we have what most criminal lawyers would call an aging out phenomena. People actually tend to get tired of being criminals. We don't know if that's true of this population because we just don't have that data, right? So I actually think part of, and this is, and I again acknowledge the work CTED is trying to do in this area, is actually to think of where our study gaps are, because that's a driver for the kind of policy you need. And I'm not sure we have that kind of comprehensive understanding even of where the gaps lie, going beyond dealing with this as a kind of an emergency problem, how do we stop people moving across borders, but more profoundly, how do we address the long-term issues of managing these kinds of populations and understanding them better, including how well they integrate. We don't actually know that very well because we don't have very good data, and that seems to me really critical.
Yeah, indeed. Peter, you've taken a pretty long view of terrorism, international terrorism in particular, and you could say to a certain extent that the foreign fighter phenomenon has complicated things because each of these individuals are individuals and they're not necessarily part of the core group, if you like. The research has been done, of course, of why terrorist groups end. Mia Bloom is here and she's done work on that, of course. Do you see the drivers of this current wave of international terrorism in any way coming to an end, or are they just changing and will encourage more recruits in the future?
I mean, the short answer is the drivers are not ending. And, you know, we do have some quite useful data about people who join ISIS. New America, which is a think tank where I work at, we looked at 3,500 ISIS recruitment forms, which are very useful because on the recruitment form you had to say where you came from, what your occupation was, what your level of knowledge was. And we did a deep dive into the Tunisians who had joined and the Saudis who had joined. And the title of the report, All Jihad is Local, which is kind of an obvious point, but is very much underlined by the people in this study. The Tunisians who joined were unemployed, underemployed, working class from areas in Tunisia which the Tunisian government has largely ignored. And the Saudis, by contrast, were middle-class people from the Najd, which of course is the heartland of Wahhabi ideology. And we didn't say Wahhabist ideology was driving this, and we didn't say poverty and unemployment were driving the Tunisians. We just observed that these are the facts. And so I think we're in a much better position today to kind of try and unpick why people joined ISIS. You mentioned the UNDP study. We have these application forms, and you know the drivers themselves are, I think, still in place.
Yeah, Nick. One other thing that Peter mentioned was the lack of day-after plans, you know, for the collapse of governments, particularly in Iraq and Libya. And that, of course, is also true in Syria, too. They will form their own day-after plan, I guess, in Syria, but they won't necessarily be the day-after plans that we would endorse, perhaps from Western countries.
I love the understatement.
So, you know, here we are now 17 years after 9/11. What has America learned, do you think? What has changed in policies of the administration that we can sort of think, oh, well, that's a step forward?
So this is the part of the panel where you hold the most recently serving government official to task for what America has done well or done poorly. Let me focus narrowly on your Syria question, Sir Richard, because I think that is where this set of issues tied to foreign terrorist fighters is most acutely felt. Again, I think that information sharing apparatus that I think that has taken quantum leaps forward in the period during which the Syria conflict has unfolded, I think that has put us in a better position to monitor something that we aren't able to control. I don't think any of us can articulate a solution in Syria right now that would give us confidence that the key underlying factors that drove the accumulation of foreign fighters won't happen again, or won't be displaced, or won't be simply replicated in some other conflict zone. But I think we do have a better architecture in place to work collectively as an international system to share information and protect ourselves. That is a very defensive strategy. It is a strategy that does not allow us to solve problems. What it does is allow us to mitigate near-term threats, and it doesn't do anything like what we need to do to encourage re-assimilation, reintegration of foreign fighters back into their home societies. But if you can start at a place of simply being able to share threatening information with each other so that at least governments are cited on what they will be coping with, that is a first step, and that is probably all we can expect in the context of the Syria conflict.
Gilles.
Yeah. May I dwell on 2 or 3 aspects that was said before? Violation of human rights and sectarianism, what Peter said. I was recently in Ramadi in the Al-Anbar province talking to the sheikh of the 15 main tribes. These are the people who supported Daesh because at the time they were so upset by the sectarian policy of the previous Prime Minister Maliki that for them it was less worse to support an organization like Daesh than the government. And the message was quite clear. Unless we get quickly improvement in housing, health, education, and jobs, the people in the tribes may be tempted for a Daesh 2.0 or 3.0, I don't know. Similarly, violation of human rights, the excellent, I think, report by UNDP, Journey to Africa, where they interviewed people who were attracted by terrorism, show very clearly that state violence, violation of human rights, is an obvious driver. So we have to work on that, on both fronts, poverty, economic development, and human rights. It seems a bit boring statement, but that remains very valid.
Well, that I'm sure we'd all agree with, but that's a very long-term development, isn't it? I mean, people aren't going to change societies and governments overnight. And in the meantime, or while we work on that, what more should we do? I mean, Peter, you mentioned about the resilience of governments and communities to deal with terrorism. How do you increase community resilience? Because I think, Fionulla, you also mentioned about the government, civil society suspicion, you know, the difficulties of governments providing civil society with information, civil society being able to act without looking as though they're in the pocket of government. We're often the civil society organizations closest to vulnerable communities are the ones least trusted by government. And so I'd like to ask both of you, if I could, Peter perhaps first, how you deal with that issue of building community resilience against the appeal of violent extremism.
Well, let me try and make a prediction about Afghanistan in 2019, so if we accept kind of what everybody has just said, and the presidential election in Afghanistan in 2019 is a total fiasco, as the last 2 have been, I think you can anticipate that the civil war that is going on there, which is relatively low grade right now, might become much stronger. You could also anticipate that President Trump or the American administration might say, well, we've tried for a long time, but now is the time to. So if you were to say, I mean, I'm just because I agree very much with Gilles and Nick. It's not really clear that the foreign fighters went anywhere else right now. I mean, it's only anecdotal. But Afghanistan is the perfect place for this to re-emerge, because there is a not insubstantial Shia community which has been attacked on a regular basis by the Taliban now, which is relatively new. There is a long history of jihadism in the region. According to the United States, there are 20 terrorist organizations that live in Afghanistan. And you could imagine this sort of history reigniting itself. So in terms of the issue of community resilience, building that is really, really kind of a complex and hard question. Destroying it is actually relatively simple. And if I was to point to a place where I think this phenomenon really could come back, it is Afghanistan, which will not be very resilient because it's gone. The war in Afghanistan started actually in 1978, even before the Soviets invaded, and this is a weak state in many ways. And these groups, there's a political law: the weaker the Muslim state, the stronger these groups. So in Indonesia, where a relatively functional government is, of course these groups exist, but they're basically not that important. In countries where the state has collapsed, like Libya and Yemen, these groups are very important. And unfortunately, I think Afghanistan may be heading in the direction of becoming a Yemen or a Libya in 2019, in particular if this presidential election goes badly.
And Fionulla, what have you got to say on this?
I mean, I think this is a long game. I come from Belfast. It took us 30 years to get to where we are now. So anyone who thinks this is a short-term game is a little naive, actually. So that's where we start from, is the long game and engaging community. And it is, these words are overused: partnership, meaningful engagement with communities, transparency. And let's start at two levels. If we look at the counter-terrorism architecture internationally, civil society isn't part of that, really. So what are we modeling for states? We're telling them we can exclude civil society from most of the formal spaces in which we do counterterrorism, but actually we'd like you to go do this domestically. So that message is entirely inconsistent and read as such. So I think there's an enormous urgency, actually, and the Office of Counterterrorism at the UN is in process of creating a civil society unit, which is actually a really important departure. Not that it's perfect, and my office has had its criticisms, as it should, but the point is that we have to model internationally what we want domestically. The second point I would say domestically, and the challenge, of course, is the commodification of civil society. So we turn to civil society when we want them, when they're useful, when we think we can get something out of them, and then we're gone, right? And so that's huge. It's both a funding challenge, it's a conceptual, it's a philosophical question. And let's be clear, for all of the governments and policymakers in the room, engaging with civil society is slow, it's tedious, they fight with each other, they're often not very good at talking to you or talking to anyone else. It often feels like the fastest way to do it is to go around them. But in the long term, we actually eat that. And so that, it seems to me, there's a fundamental shift. And the place where this has to happen is in CVE and PVE policy, which are in grave danger, both internationally and nationally, of simply commodifying civil societies in a way that is ultimately going to be. So I think there's a twofold start, and it has to start. We have to model internationally and regionally what we're asking governments to do domestically.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The states tend to, when a problem becomes completely intractable, pass it to the United Nations, and now the United Nations have found somebody to pass it on to after them. But Nick, will you come in on this?
Well, the question of community resilience is something that's very much on the mind, I think, of many Americans this week, given what we've experienced in recent days. And I think one of the things we've learned is that extremism comes in many forms, and it can come in the form of an ISIS narrative or an Al-Qaeda narrative, but it can also come in the form of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, or some other violent extremist agenda. And I get to Fionulla's point, I think as a matter of last resort, I think government policy will end up looking at communities to solve these problems for themselves, because it's very difficult to envision them being solved with government-led programs at a national level. In our system in the United States, I think my sense of confidence comes from from knowing that in most cases communities do know best what is going on in their communities, and so in terms of anticipating who might be an extremist on the verge of committing a terrible act, or who might be a potential foreign fighter looking to go abroad, those answers aren't likely to come from Washington. They're more likely to come from community activists, from community leaders. Our challenge in Washington during my period of government service was to give those community leaders or those local officials more information, more resources, more understanding of the global picture so that they could act on what they were seeing in their own communities. Unfortunately, we haven't done that at scale in the United States. We do that episodically and not in a way that covers all of the different areas across the United States where this extremism is a problem. So I hope, again, if there can be anything positive to emerge from the recent experience in the United States, it'll be that we get serious about some of this community engagement and civil society engagement work that Fionulla was referring to.
Thanks. Peter, you mentioned the growing sectarianism that lies behind a lot of these problems, and geopolitical developments aren't particularly conducive to coming to international agreements and solutions for them. And in an area, in an age when polarization is particularly prominent, I wonder perhaps I can ask you all what you think about the trend in this area to look at preventing extremism rather than just preventing violent extremism, when in an atmosphere where polarization, people are taking stronger and stronger positions and defining themselves as to what they're not rather than what they are. It seems to me to be going in two different directions. Perhaps, Peter, I could ask you first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think preventing extremism is a laudable goal, but I think, trying to stop radicalization is like trying to boil the ocean, because there's lots of radicals in the world and then there are very few violent people. I mean, if let's say that we take the absolute maximum number of people we think joined ISIS, it might be, 120,000, 150,000, As a proportion of the Islamic population in the world, that's, it's an infinitesimal percentage. So the real goal is not to, if we could stop extremism, great. But what we really want to do is stop people joining these organizations. So the most important goal is a counter-recruitment strategy, not a counter-radicalization strategy. And if you accept that as the case, then you can start thinking about very targeted things, because we know from a lot of social science research that the people who join these organizations often do with their friends or their family members. So if you see friends and family members joining, you want to start looking at the other members in the family, the other members of the social group. This would be one very kind of classic police effort that would actually be potentially effective. I profiled a group, 3 kids from Chicago, the Khan family. One was 17, the other was 16, the other one was 15. They joined, luckily they got arrested at Chicago airport, but they joined as a family. And so if you're ultimately, as a national security professional, you're trying to stop people joining this violent group. And who has the information about this? So the FBI has done very interesting work in the United States. The people who know the most are peers. The people who know the second most are family members. The people who know the next are authority figures like teachers and clerics and bosses. And the people who know the least are strangers. But interestingly, strangers are the people who are most likely to inform, and they have the least useful information. And peers are the least likely to come forward, but they have the most useful information. So in the case of, in the tragedy in the United States, that Nick just referred to, the family members knew that there were these perpetrators, that there was something wrong with them. They were asking them to seek medical help. So again, this is something we know from social science that is useful in preventing these things, which is, and this gets to the community engagement. The people who you have to most engage, the people who have the most information are peers and family members. If you alienate them, let's say in the United States, by sort of saying all Muslims are bad, which is certainly a message that we've heard from some of our political leaders, that is not going to get them to be helpful. So I think we actually know quite a lot from social science about how to prevent people joining these organizations. It's not going to be perfect. People will always get through. But 10 years ago, we didn't necessarily know the things we know today.
I still believe that even if it's impossible, we need to address extremism and not just violent extremism. By the way, I was visiting Belfast recently. I was a bit shocked to see that there were still 48 walls inside Belfast out of 60.
That's what a successful agreement looks like. We ought to be more modest about what we count as success.
And a Brexit which would lead to a new border between Northern Ireland and Ireland may reignite the tension. I was extremely surprised to see that on the ground. But that's why I raised the issue of the ideology. Let's be honest. The Muslim world is still very divided, as Peter said, between Shia and Sunni, and in the Sunni world between those who support and not support the Muslim Brothers and so on, and between Catholic and Protestant. And we see the rise in Europe of far-right, hatred, anti-Semitic discourse. This is worrying, and so we cannot just ignore that, and that requires that we look at and especially it's amplified by social networks, and there is a huge work in Europe to look into this. We will have a legislation to remove unlawful content, even if we don't have a worldwide definition of terrorism. We, by and large, know what we mean by removing unlawful content, but we try to have with the big companies code of conduct to reduce the level of hatred on internet. That plays a role. We need to work in it. And work more. It was a huge effort for me to convince the colleagues in the European Commission to do a lot more and to mainstream counter-violent or counter-extremism in education, in sport, in culture a lot. We are not doing that enough. I think that's still very important, even if it's a long term, but I'm worried by the rise of this polarization in our society.
Indeed. And Nick, can I ask you to comment on this?
Well, I guess I would point to some of the same factors that Peter mentioned. In looking at the set of cases in the United States where an individual has been arrested for a terrorism offense, in almost every instance, certainly over 75 or 80% of the instances, there has been someone in the immediate environment of the individual who saw the problem emerging before it actually resulted in laws being broken or the person carrying out some sort of criminal or terrorist act. And so if the objective is to prevent, I think we've heard our FBI director say he doesn't want to have to arrest our way out of extremism problems or terrorism problems, that cries out for identifying individuals before they become foreign terrorist fighters, at the point when they are dabbling, at the point when they are experimenting with ideas, at the point where the individual is maybe on a path but is not yet irrevocably on that path. And yet that very set of activities I just mentioned of getting ahead of the problem is not something that is done well from a national capital. It has to be done at a very localized level. And yet you can't just expect towns and cities and local police forces to have the skills and the resources to engage in that kind of work unless the resources are provided at a national level. So it's a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, I suppose I would take probably a more trenchant view on the notion. First of all, if we have, I would agree with you, we have, notwithstanding that there's no global multilateral treaty on terrorism, we do have a space of overlapping, including a Security Council resolution where we have a working definition of terrorism. But on violent extremism and on extremism, we actually have no state consensus on what that means. And I would worry extremely about states taking their marching orders on a term where the extremist is someone who disagrees with government. The extremist is someone who has a different point of view. The extremist is a philosopher or a poet who happens to say something that the state disagrees with. I think we cannot assume that the term extremism will be applied with any degree of consistency, or that it will be applied in a non-self-interested way for states who want to consolidate power and who are not interested in addressing the broader issues of polarization. So I think the mandate has been very opposed to the use of that term as a matter of regulatory function in this area. But I will say this question then of how you address these broader set of behaviors is real. And the example I would give, when the mandate visited Belgium this summer, I was in Belgium for a number of weeks, and in some ways that's the example of, at every level of government, you see, partly facilitated by the fact that this is both a federal and a canton structure. You have everything from play groups to local theatre to engagement of different kinds and levels of, and the word violent extremism isn't used, and actually it works better because it's not, because actually the use of that word, when you say to a community, you're radicalized, so we are going to provide programming for you, what you're really doing is stigmatizing that community as a set of radicals and treating them as others. So we also have to be very careful about the way we engage with communities, that by our very act of saying we're going to work on you, we stigmatize them further, we alienate them even more from the state, we make them feel like outsiders. And I have to say, as a special rapporteur, I have a really serious concern that legitimate practice, religious practice, as for Muslims in particular, in many parts of the globe, both cultural and religious practice is viewed as per se suspect, as a form of per se radicalization by communities and political systems who are inhospitable to anything that looks different from the majority religious viewpoint. And I think that's a really dangerous line that we walk in these areas when communities are effectively made into suspect communities by the way in which we use. So I don't have a bullet solution, but what I would say is that we have to be very nuanced and we have to walk with communities, not talk down to those communities. We have to partner with them in meaningful ways, and we don't do that very well.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute, so if you have questions, please raise your hand. I'm just going to put one more issue while you think of your questions to the panel here, and that is on this whole business of identity. And Gilles has talked about religious divides, as has Peter and Fionulla, but identity, of course, is not just expressed in religious terms, also expressed in ethnic terms and so on. And on the right wing, we see it very much expressed in ethnic terms. And if you come down to the reasons where individuals have joined Islamic State or other terrorist groups, you'll find they're very, very personal and particular and very, very local. And in this case, you know, if we're looking at the international community to respond, it's unlikely to connect with local issues, and government, as you've all mentioned, also has difficulty. And if it's civil society, it comes down to family and peers, as Peter mentioned. So are we really trying to do something which is unachievable, and we have to just allow the cycle of history to pass through and we all get concerned about something else? So while you're pondering that, I'm going to look to the audience, and I saw a hand here in the second row. Perhaps you could provide a microphone there. And then I saw one at the back, another one at the back, and one here in the middle, if the people with the microphones could approach them. Yeah, and Mark in the front there. So while the microphones are arriving, would you comment on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, of course we want to do as much as we can do and not be defeatist. And there's probably been a lot of successes that we can't measure, because by definition the successes are not measurable. People who don't become terrorists, you can't quantify that. So, I mean, one thing we haven't really discussed is the role of social media and kind of, Nick alluded to the terms of use. One problem, YouTube has 400 hours a minute being uploaded of video, which gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. But I mean, I think the social media companies have gotten a lot better in the last 3 or 4 years, but there's a long way to go, and it's not just jihadist material, it's right-wing material and all sorts of other extremist material.
Anybody else like to comment before we go to questions?
No, I confirm that the companies have improved, but we had to push hard to get some result. Now the Commission has tabled a draft legislation to foresee a sort of removal order that government could address to the companies, which is not very liked on the other side of the Atlantic because of free speech, First Amendment concern. But we still believe there are still room for improvement. We would like the companies to remove, not to upload in the first place, but to remove within an hour any unlawful content. We're not there yet, and so I hope, but it's not just that. I think address as well the algorithm of Google, which is a sort of echo chamber, which will give you always more of the same. So if you are searching for hatred, you will get even more hatred. And this is a serious problem that has not been addressed yet because it's linked to the core of the algorithm of search companies. So that's an ongoing discussion we have with the media companies. We are on the right track.
Can I just add a note on the media companies, because I've had an extended conversation with Facebook in particular. One is just to note that Facebook's definition of terrorism does not comport to any international definition. They have their own definition defined by their community standards. So I have to say, I think we all ought to be concerned when you have an entity which has state-like capacity but actually sits outside of the global framework of norms. And while I concur entirely that we have to have methods of regulating them, they also have to be compliant with basic due process and rule of law norms themselves. So I think that gap is also in need of closure, and it's one that the mandate has been anxious to close with tech companies who are effectively defining their own legal universes here in ways that are in many ways unaccountable.
Yes, I think the next panel will talk a little bit about this whole issue of narrative, so we'll perhaps leave that for them. But I think I pick up from what Peter said about the low number of people actually engaged in terrorism and all the people who don't engage in terrorism, that the response must always be proportionate to the threat, and judging the threat, of course, is therefore key. But let me turn to the first member of the audience with a question.
لا شك أن الإيديولوجيا كان لها دور كبير في نشر الأفكار التي أدت إلى التطرف، وهذا يحتاج إلى معالجة من خلال الفكر ومن خلال استخدام المراجعات وليس استخدام العنف دائما. وأنا أعتقد أن السبب الأكثر مباشرة لانتشار ظاهرة الإرهاب في سوريا بلدي تحديدا هو ما جرى من سياسات النظام المجرم، سياسات بشار الأسد تجاه من يقول عنهم أنهم أبناء شعبه. فهو استخدم العنف منذ اليوم الأول من المظاهرات السلمية التي انتشرت في كل أنحاء سوريا. ومن لا يعلم أقول بأن هذا النظام استخدم العنف والعنف المفرط تجاه المظاهرات السلمية، واعتقل الكثير من طلاب المدارس والجامعات الذين كانوا في تلك المظاهرات، وفي المقابل أطلق سراح العديد من المتطرفين الذين كانوا موجودين في سجون النظام. بالإضافة إلى أنه استخدم كل الأدوات المحظورة أو الأسلحة المحظورة تجاه شعبه منذ 8 سنوات، مما أدى إلى مقتل أكثر من 500,000 مواطن سوري، وتدمير أكثر من 60% من البنية التحتية، وتهجير أكثر من 9 مليون سوري خارج مناطقهم. وهذا أدى أيضا إلى شعور بالإحباط والظلم تجاه ما يجري في سوريا وتجاه صمت المجتمع الدولي. هذا أحد الأسباب، بالإضافة إلى الفقر والجهل والظلم هو الأساس. كان في قدوم المقاتلين الأجانب من خارج سوريا، بل انتماء بعض المقاتلين السوريين إلى التنظيمات الإرهابية، ليس اعتقادا بالفكر والإيديولوجيا، لكن شعور بأنه هذه التنظيمات يمكن أن تكون هي الأقوى وأن تكون في مواجهة النظام. نحن بحاجة فعلا إلى معالجة أصل المشكلة وأصل الإرهاب وأسباب نشوئه، وليس محاربته بطريقة عنيفة. وأنا أعتقد بأنه لدينا تجربة مهمة جدا الآن في إدلب، حيث يتركز حوالي 15,000 مقاتل، يعني الجزء الأقل منهم من المهاجرين من خارج سوريا، وهؤلاء إذا لم تتاح لهم الفرصة فهم سيقاتلون حتى الموت في تلك المنطقة لأنهم وصلوا إلى النهاية. شكرا لكم.
So this comment really was about Syria and about the regime reaction to peaceful protest, and that being indeed cause of much of the problem. And I guess it's true that the motivation of many foreigners who went there was to help protect the community from the depredations of the regime. And those people, by definition, therefore, wouldn't have gone to train as to come back to be domestic terrorists, but rather take part in that foreign war. And I think this is something that our assessment of the threat should take into account. But let me turn to, and who's got a microphone now? Dan, have you got a microphone? There's some at the back there as well, if there's another microphone available.
Thank you. My name is Fatima Madiw. I come from Albania, former defense minister. It was mentioned, but one of the concerns that I see with the foreign fighters is not just the ones that return to their countries, but also we have foreign fighters that have served in, their sentence in the jail. And what's happened during their time in jail, the recruitment that happens in jail sometimes, and what are the policies in place after they serve their time in jail, in prison. So I see that as a big concern after they serve their time in jail. So if it's any answer from the European perspective or US on that matter.
The first challenge, as I understand, is to detect signs of radicalization in prison. A French scholar who looked at this 10 years ago, he said it was quite easy to detect these signs of radicalization in prison. These days, probably the most radicals are hiding their radicalization. So the first challenge is to determine who might be radicalized in prison, which we know are a major incubator of radicalization. For instance, the French now have created a dedicated security service for the prison, just to do that. So the first is to spot. Second is to start working on this engagement program, and that's what I said before. I'm afraid we're not very advanced. We try to encourage member states to do that. We have supported in some member states some experience, but there is a lot more to do. I don't know, you said you are coming from Albania, or? Yeah, right? I was in Tirana less than a month ago, and we have discussed that because you are faced with the same problem. So we try to help and to disseminate the best practices, but we are far from having found the real solution. After prison, as I said, prison leavers, it's even more difficult because in principle you cannot impose an additional sanctions. But I see that some of our member states are trying to find ways. You cannot monitor 24/7 someone, too many people. I'm told that you need 20 to 25 staff to monitor only one. So could you imagine to monitor 50, or I said 450 for France, which is huge. So there you need to find ways to control orders, or in the worst case, regular report, electronic bracelet, and so on. But there too, this engagement program. So for me, it's one of the top concerns, to have more effective one.
We've got very little time left, I'm afraid, only about 8 minutes according to my timer here. And there were 3 hands up at the back. Perhaps we can take those 3 questions together. And there's 2 at the front here as well.
Hi, I'm Alison Muse from the Asia Times. I was curious, given the reports that France is seeking to repatriate some 150 children from Northern Syria, which I'd assume would be without the mothers who are being tried through judicial processes, is the EU seeking to come up with a unified approach on how to deal with these people? children's wives, etc. And if possible, could any of the panelists comment on Asian foreign fighter returnees? Thank you.
And at the back. At the back there. Way over. Would you like to comment on that while we're waiting?
I'll talk to the Asian issue
yeah.
briefly, if that's okay. So one of the issues I didn't mention earlier when I was talking about the quantity of foreign fighter information that we gathered was that I should have also added that one of the things we learned is that, in a sense, numbers don't matter. It's quality that matters. If an individual foreign terrorist fighter has a particular skill set or a particular network or a particular reach, then in a sense it doesn't matter whether there was one of them or 10,000 of them. If this one individual is a threat, then that is something that has to be managed. And I would point to Southeast Asia as a theater, a part of the world where this is of particular importance. There were undoubtedly individuals from Southeast Asia, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from the Philippines, who traveled to fight in Iraq and Syria. And undoubtedly some of them have made their way back home and may continue to pursue jihad from Southeast Asia. And again, this is where I would argue that quantity doesn't matter. It's making sure that you've identified who the individuals are, what skill sets they have, and making sure that the security services of those countries, those receiving countries, are well equipped to be able to cope with it.
And quite unusually, Malaysia has encouraged all its citizens to come back, while most countries have not. And France, of course, recently agreed to 150 children.
I think it was in the media, but I'm not aware that there is a decision to proactively bring 150 children back. The French have a very sophisticated mechanism to handle the children when they come back. So it's quite impressive. But for the time being, it's on a case-by-case basis. When there is the consent of the mother, in Syria often you need some talk to, and they don't talk to the Assad regime, so it's a difficult issue. The Kurdish government is not recognized, and so this is tricky. I myself said that I believe it would be a good idea to go for a more coordinated EU policy in this respect. Why? Because at a recent meeting of the Radicalization Aware Network, we discussed the matter, and all the specialists, especially excellent psychiatrists in Avicenne, which is the main hospital in France where they put the children when they're back, the main message was the sooner the better. If you want, I don't believe you can deprogram someone, but the quicker, the earlier you can do it, the better, because you will have some impact. If you leave these children for 10 years in a camp, they will probably get back home with hatred and more violence. That if you do that very early when they are 5, 6, 7 years old, I'm not a specialist, but it seems that you can reach better results. So, but the French have a very sophisticated. I have not heard any formal confirmation that they would do that with 50 in a row. Yeah.
So.
I'm from Malaysia, and I work on strategic communications. So I would like to thank the panelists for the brilliant presentation, because it gives me some ideas for my work. Now my question is, how do you think, how much is it that the inability of governments to reintegrate some of these foreign terrorist fighters, their political squeamishness, their willingness to bring them back into society, would actually have an impact, especially considering the possibilities with a lot of these grievances going around against groups like Daesh over the atrocities that they commit, to the, how would you say, fueling the narratives and, how would you say, developing the future waves of terrorists, because this is something that I'm quite interested in, finding more about how the actions of, for example, governments might have an impact on making it easier for terrorists to spread their narratives and spread their influence. Thank you.
Peter, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind commenting on that. While the microphones come to the front row, we have 2 questions here in the front row, and then I think we'll have to draw to a close after those.
Well, just say,
Please. Good afternoon. My name is Kumar. I'm from the External Intelligence Agency of India. I have a specific question addressed to Mr. Peter Bergen. We share his concerns about the trajectory of developments in Afghanistan. But the question that I would put to him is, would he agree that the fundamental problem in Afghanistan remains the use of violent extremist groups by states as proxies to achieve certain geopolitical ends? These are the groups that fundamentally erode the writ of the state, and I say this in the context of your observation about the forthcoming presidential elections. And an over-anxiety to negotiate with such groups before they unambiguously renounce violence, could it not have potentially catastrophic consequences? Thank you.
So there's a highly political question.
Well, I wonder which proxy state you might be referring to, sir, but, I mean, look, let's do the thought experiment where Pakistan supported absolutely no groups in Afghanistan. Afghanistan would still be quite a violent place. However, it is certainly a fact that Pakistan does support these groups, and that does amplify the violence. But let's not pretend that the problems in Afghanistan aren't also sectarian and ethnic that have existed for decades. And as for talking to the Taliban, I think the Trump administration is doing the right thing, because as long as your expectations are very low, I mean, the war has gone on for 17 years. We've tried 100,000 troops, we've tried 15,000 troops, it hasn't worked. And so talking to the Taliban has, I mean, Fionulla knows this better than anybody else coming from Belfast. I mean, there's a reason to talk to your enemies beyond maybe getting peace after 30 years. One is to gather intelligence. The other one is to create splits in the group. Some people may want peace, some people may want to continue to fight. There's really nothing to lose by talking to the Taliban. And, you know, the Trump administration, to its credit, and it's not a phrase I use all the time, you know, I think is doing the right thing here, because nothing else has really worked.
Well, I was hoping to come all the way to Doha and talk about foreign fighters without hearing the word Brexit, but unfortunately that wasn't to be the case. But nonetheless, in all other respects, may I thank very much Gilles, Peter, Fionulla and Nick for this very stimulating panel. Thank you very much.